So, to tonight's lecture. I'm not going to start with those boring words, Stephen Brindle needs no introduction, because I've always believed that in a lecture, you should start by giving the lecturer a start a bit like the catapult on an aircraft carrier, so that they're in a good mood, and everyone's in a good mood before they start. And it's not difficult to do that with Stephen. He has just published the most stupendous book entitled Architecture in Britain and Ireland, 1530 to 1830, which most of you already have at your bedsides. If it's on a bedside table, the bedside table will have collapsed, or are about to receive from a relation. And what a wonderful time you're going to have. And I was going to say it's Stephen's magnum opus, but of course he's got about 18 other magnum opus to his name, including a biography of Brunel, a book about Paddington, the great book, even heavier, on Windsor Castle. More than 10 men can really produce in a lifetime have come out of one individual, and we've got him here this evening to talk about craftsmen and the development of construction in the 17th century. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Robert, thank you very much for that more than generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this seventh and last of our anniversary series. Yes, this lecture arises out of work done for my book, Architecture in Britain and Ireland, 1530 to 1830, and you will note the similarity in its title of that of the well-known previous work by the late Sir John Sunson. But my book, of course, is not a revision. It's a very different book, and is very deliberately intended to take a very different view. And the Summersonian view of history expresses what you might call the art historical canon, whereby architectural history in the 17th and 18th century in this country is seen in terms of a canon, a succession of celebrated, named, famous architects who produced a succession of famous named buildings. And it is my contention that although this approach certainly has internal coherence and is memorable, and indeed is lodged probably all too deeply in our memories, that it is fundamentally misleading and ahistorical at the same time, and a different approach to the subject is needed. And my contention is that the handful of famous architects and the slightly larger handful in the early 18th century were bobbing on the surface, shall we say, of roiling currents, of turbulent waters, currents of which were shaped by forces, by quite other forces, most importantly by craftspeople, by the clients, and by the suppliers of building materials in complex negotiations with each other. And my contention is that the building world of the Georgian age, within which Wren and Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor and Henry Flitcroft and Robert Taylor and Robert Adam and John Soane all worked, assumptions about plan forms, materials, construction methods, foundation methods, sourcing of materials, pricing, how to make a floor, how to make a roof, what size and shape of them should be, heating, lighting, ventilation, all of that was made. The matrix, the mental world, building world that the Georgian architects operated in was, I contend, made in the 17th century in a transformation of building culture effected almost entirely by craftspeople with hardly an architect represented. One or two architects crop up once or twice, and there is one who I think is fairly central, has a fairly central position, but I think the results would have been the same if the architects hadn't been there at all. The building world of the 17th century was not made by professionals, by architects and engineers, for the simple reason that professions as yet hardly existed. Now, within late medieval building culture, and well into the 16th century, there was a marked duality, very marked indeed, between masonry construction on the one hand, load-bearing brick and stone, and framed construction in timber. And the two types were managed by completely different craft groups, by masons and bricklayers, or by carpenters. They were different crafts, different mysteries, they had different training, and so far as we know, no mason ever became a carpenter or vice versa. So the distinction was a fundamental one. although very often, of course, in fact, on almost every major project, there had to be a degree of collaboration. The nature of that collaboration is one of the things we know least about. And the next point, which will occur to you very quickly, is that there is a marked disparity in number here. The masons and bricklayers account for maybe, what would you say, 10%, 15% across the south and the eastern counties and Midlands. And the carpenters running up framed buildings like this was an everyday occupation, 85%, 95%. It is hard to grasp now how ubiquitous framed construction was in medieval England, in Tudor England, when basically the whole of a town consisted of framed houses with stone used for the town walls, the churches, the royal castle if there was one. And this situation, this duality, persisted right through the 16th century, right through the Elizabethan age. Here are 16th century buildings, the manor house at Kingston Moorwood, which shows how wonderfully the perpendicular masons tradition evolved and adapted in the new secular post-Reformation house building world, and these rather wonderful houses on Mermaid Street in Rye. Now today, timber-framed houses like this strike us as something quaint and picturesque and lovely and evocative, and it can be, but usually they come in ones or twos, as they do here in Rye. Occasionally they come in slightly larger groups, but it can be hard to grasp how ubiquitous framed construction was in the early 16th century. And the other thing to say is that the framed buildings which survive are probably, for the most part, a misleading representative. They are not representative of the house at the time. They survived because they were of high quality, and the mass of the building stock of much lower quality has not survived. So what you are seeing for the most part when you see surviving framed houses like this one or places like Shrewsbury and Canterbury are the good ones, the expensive ones, and the common stock, the commonality of building for the poor, that's all gone. So it's not quite representative as a sample. And it gives very little sense of what a Tudor town actually looked and felt like. But what a difference a century makes. Within 100 years, the commonality of building, of residential architecture across most of southern and eastern England and the Midlands, anywhere where there wasn't good building stone immediately to hand, is now brick and terraced and with upright windows. And windows have converged, as we will see, on a very narrow range of forms, and the whole range of building shapes and plans has narrowed, a bit like the way in which car design tended to converge on a narrow range of shapes in the late 20th century. And this is one of the striking things about this subject, the way in which the variety, which I think reached its height in the late 16th, early 17th century, variety of building shapes, of window shapes, of approaches to planning, then got narrower and narrower and narrower into the early 18th century, until it reached something which, roughly fitted with Palladian classical conceptions of aesthetic propriety. But let's get on to that. Who had effected this revolution in building, and what were the important influences that shaped it? Well, I've already given some fairly broad hints as to my views here. It was craftspeople in negotiation with their clients, and also, although this is not really a matter I understand very well, the people who supplied them with materials. And we start with the most fundamental issue of all, and this is the transition from framed construction to thin-walled brick construction. I say thin-walled brick, and this is an important point, which I think I'd better go back a few stages to. You'll note that here I use a brick building to illustrate masonry construction in late medieval England. That is, of course, St. John's College, Cambridge. And in the 16th century, you might say there were two main ways of using brick, as a sown substitute or as an infill for timber. And here, clearly, it's being used as a sown substitute. These walls are thick, probably about 1 meter thick, and they are built in fundamentally the same kind of way as a stone masonry wall would be built, with a bonded surface, and a core, which is probably either of uncoursed brickwork, or might actually be of rubble, or in a couple of cases was actually just of earth fill. You can see foundations of Greenwich Palace under the Painted Hall, where the wall looks like a cavity wall because the archaeologists have scooped the loose fill out of the middle. So in medieval building culture, a major evolution was in progress, stretching from the 14th century into the 15th century into 16th century, into in some areas into the 17th century, a gradual upgrading in the quality of timber framing and in the quality of houses, in the quality of the accommodation. And this is the term, the Great Rebuilding, is rather loosely applied to the renewal of housing, the upgrading of housing in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. I think the term should be applied actually still more widely and more loosely than that, because it applies in the 14th and 15th, 16th centuries to the upgrading of timber construction, and then in the 16th and 17th centuries, it applies to the replacement of timber framing by thin-walled brick or by stone construction. So the Great Rebuilding is really a very loose term indeed. It's not at all precise, and it, in many cases, there were more than one generation of rebuilding, as we will see. But the first great transition, which isn't even represented here, is from building with earth-fast posts to building where the posts are raised on stone padstones or foundations, which you note I don't show here at all. And the reason I don't show it here is because there is so little direct archaeological evidence for it. The point about buildings with earth-fast posts is the feet of the posts decay, and the houses disappear completely. And the only trace they leave are the sort of traces which very good archaeologists might find. By the 15th century, carpenters worked this out, and it was becoming, for the better quality of cruck-framed houses, the kind you see on top, who built off padstones, because the crucks were expensive, half an oak tree, and if you raised it on a padstone, it would last more than 100 years, and if you didn't, it wouldn't. And for that reason, the vast majority of the cruck-framed houses that we have, the crucks sit on padstones. And there is virtually no archaeological evidence for earth-fast crucks because they've gone. What we do have are cases where the crucks have been scarfed and new feet put on them low down on padstones, and it is supposed that the padstones and the bottom of the crucks were pieced in. But that is the best I can say. The first you hear, I wanted it to be with earth-fast posts, and I received a criticism on the ground that there are actually no surviving examples of this. I thought, oh. So I put the padstones in. But the main point is to show you an upgrading in the quality of timber-framed architecture from cruck framing, which is essentially a one-storied mode of construction with an earth floor and a central hearth, to a box frame, which, as you see, is raised on stone footings with a base plate and a roof plate, and again, an earth floor with a central hearth. So part of the house has to be raised all the way to the roof. And in the 16th century, the use of fired materials to upgrade box-framed construction so that we have brick footings, a brick chimney stack. We no longer have a central hearth, so there can be a full first floor. We have clay tiles on the roof, and we have glass in the windows. And that, as you'll see, although the framing, the carpentry, is very largely the same, this is an enormous upgrading in the quality and the comfort of the house produced thereby. And I illustrate it here with, this is the Bayleaf. This is a reconstructed Wealden house, which, as you see, has a central hall. It would have had a central hearth. It sits on stone footings. It was a prosperous yeoman's house in the 15th century, and it was taken down and rebuilt at the wonderful Wealden Downland Museum. And on the right, a farmhouse at Brent Ely, and this represents the third stage in that slide, and it has stacks, and it has herringbone infill, and the fired materials are the key to upgrading it, an enormous upgrade in terms of its resistance to cold and damp and pests, comfort and drafts. And so carpenters were working in close collaboration with bricklayers and tilers across much of Elizabethan England. And in the 17th century, the nature of this collaboration evolved. Now, brick construction originated in this country only in the 13th century, and it was brought by Flemish craftspeople. And in the Netherlands, they had rather more sophisticated construction techniques because, of course, in our low-lying country, very little good building stone. And already in the 15th century, in places like Bruges, which you see here, they had evolved methods for building off timber piles and piled platforms, building thin-walled brick houses, which obviously greatly reduces the amount of timber you need, because Netherlands, a densely populated area, was suffering a timber famine a long way before England did. And so the thin-walled brick construction techniques I'm talking about here, where brick walls were of thicknesses comparable to those in a modern house, were pioneered in the Netherlands. And already by the mid-15th century, they were being brought to England, almost certainly by Flemish craftspeople, but there are very few surviving examples or known examples, and one which I owe to Paul Drury is Croydon Palace Chapel, which has a timber frame, so you can still say it's like an infilled frame, but it's walls of 9-inch brick, that's very thin indeed, between the timber uprights. So there was already the beginnings of a move here towards thin-walled brick construction with concealed timber framing, which is really what we're talking about. Hill Hall in Essex is another case in point, and this is another that I owe to Paul Drury, to Drury and Simpson's marvellous monograph on this house. Sir Thomas Smith, diplomat, inherited an old manor house through his wife here, and in the 1550s, Sir Thomas was out of favour with Queen Mary, but he wanted a courtyard house, as the smart thing to have, and he rebuilt the house with thin brick walls. They were no more than about 18 inches thick, hardly thicker than a modern suburban house. But Paul found from evidence and footings of it that it would have had stacks on the external walls, that the internal partitions were of timber. The internal partitions would have both braced the walls apart and tied them together. The internal partitions would have risen into and formed part of the roof frame. Almost certainly, all of the openings, the doors and windows would have had timber lintels, because of course bricks cannot form lintels, they just can't make them big enough. And so within a brick in the stone built house, a lot of the openings may have timber lintels. In a brick building, all the openings ipso facto are either arched or have timber lintels. The house was rebuilt again in the 1560s in the reign of Elizabeth, when Sir Thomas was back in favour and he'd been Elizabeth's ambassador in France, and the walls were thicker, but again, there was a lot of structural timber in it. And Hill Hall probably represented techniques of thin-walled brick construction, which were already becoming widespread in London and the southeast, in areas, especially in areas where timber was becoming scarcer. And it's quite difficult to find standing examples of this, but examples have been found in archaeological excavation, like these 17th century buildings in Spitalfields, excavated by the Museum of London Archaeology. And as you see, they have fairly thin brick walls, and these were probably 2- and 3-story buildings. Now we know that elsewhere in London at the time, in the 1630s and 40s and 50s, in Shadwell, for example, and in Wapping, closer to the river, timber-framed construction with infilling was in the norm, but in Spitalfields, not at all far away, you might say the brick threshold had been passed, because it was because brick earth was available right there, and so brick was just that bit cheaper. And so we might think of the transition from framed construction brick in London in terms of the Great Fire, but actually this transition was in progress long before then. And it's recorded to some extent in a whole succession of royal proclamations on building in London, issued, probably drafted by Inigo Jones as surveyor of works, and issued on behalf of King James I. And there weren't just these 2, there were about 10 of these from the 16 teens right into the late 1620s. And they all tend to say the same kind of things. New houses to be faced in brick and stone, all stories to be at least 10 feet high, and they specify thicknesses of the walls in 2-story and in 3-story houses. And so London had established standards for thin-walled brick construction long before the Great Fire of London and the Building Acts which followed it. But the fact that the proclamations had to be reissued so many times, I think tells us a number of things. Most importantly, that it was quite difficult to get the Londoners to take much notice. And they paid attention when they wanted to. Of course, there are a number of factors at work here. One is the greater resistance of brick to fire, and another was the rising cost of timber and the fact that most structural timber being used in London by this date was imported, was oak or increasingly deal from the Baltic. And as the cost of timber rose and the cost of brick went down, so framed building with brick infill declined in London and across the southeast in favour of thin-walled brick construction with concealed structural timber. And the London terrace house, you might say, is the result. And techniques for thin-walled brick urban houses and their structural carpentry were standardised well before 1700 through a mixture of cross practice in response, I think, to these official interventions. So here are diagrams from two of the better known books, and what we notice at once is how far the house is a thin-walled brick box. In one case, the stack is internal to it. In another, the stack is on the party wall. And note how the two different approaches to using the main girders. In one case, the carpenter seems to think that the really important thing is to brace the party walls apart, and in the other, and I can't quite explain this, he seems to think the really important thing is that it's also important to brace the front and back facades too. I wonder if this is something to do with the height of the house. I'm really not at all sure. But the main point I want to make here is that technically, this transformation from timber framing with brick and to thin-walled brick construction with concealed structural timber, a lot of concealed structural timber, was happening across the 17th century in London. It's prefigured in those world proclamations. By the time we see it in these books, it's there, it's codified and standardized long before Wren's 1667 Act. And so the construction of urban terrace houses, the Barban type of houses, was standardized, as we see in those books, well before 1700, and could be managed by a bricklayer or a carpenter. Typically would be managed by a bricklayer or a carpenter as the lead contractor. Quite a lot depended on whether craftsmen decided to make the stack internal to the house, but in the 18th century, it became increasingly common to locate the stacks on the party walls, and thus the entire structure, the entire internal structure of a Georgian terrace house is quite commonly made of timber, as many of you will know. So this is a house in St. John's Place from Peter Guillory's very wonderful book, The Small House in 18th Century London, which I owe a great deal to. And on the right is a cutaway of an 18th century terrace house made by Carlos Lemus for my book. Now, of course, framed construction didn't disappear, but it's hidden in one way or another. And on the left is a celebrated and rather wonderful example of the way in which timber frame construction might seem to disappear from our streets. There, of course, is a really very nice, rather smart 16th century frame. Look at all that cross bracing on Belmont in Shrewsbury, and I think you can see what's happened. Someone has built a very smart Georgian facade in front of it, and of course, the brick facade wrapped round the corner. Until the 20th century, someone found the timber frame and thought it would be a fun idea, as indeed it is, to take the brick off. So you can see exactly what's happened, and it's really quite dramatic, isn't it? And that does make you think, how many more of these are there out there? I would guess rather a lot. And as an example, here's houses on that rather underestimated town, Rochester's rather wonderful high street. And you do wonder how many of these houses, especially the tile-hung ones and the boarded ones, how many of them are still framed houses going up and being given weatherboarding or tile hanging or mathematical tiles in the 18th century, or are any of them actually medieval frames which have been refenestrated and given a new cladding? And I think there'll be a whole range of answers to that question as the prestige and the fashionableness of classicism overwhelmed traditional framed construction and overwhelmed its distinctive but by then sadly old-fashioned aesthetic. And every now and then one gets sort of fragments and insights of just how much structural carpentry there is behind most all London terrace houses, like this marvelous picture of an 18th century terrace house in Stepney, where, as you can see, the entire brick facade pretty much has fallen off, but the house is still standing because the frame construction is standing. I think that's probably a fairly extreme case, but it seems to be, and remember, that must be as late as 1800, 1810. Date Stepney was going up, Andrew, 1810s. So the persistence of these techniques of thin wall brick construction, but the whole body of the house is still a frame. So that's our first great theme, the evolution from traditional frame construction to thin wall brick construction with concealed structural timber, in which the carpenters are still right there at the heart of the building process, but their work is covered up by the bricks, by the brick. And next, let's think about building shapes and what this means in terms of roof shapes. In medieval England, almost all buildings of all kinds, he said sweepingly, were formed of elements one room deep, arranged in combination. And you might have porches and bays and little wings and stacks projecting, but nevertheless, the fundamental elements usually have an external wall on both sides. And so here's Barrington Court in Somerset and Swakeleys in Middlesex, illustrating this approach to design. And in the 17th century, as life was getting colder in the Little Ice Age, compact plans, 2 rooms deep, began to gain ground. That isn't to say that there were no compact plan buildings in England before. There were in quite small numbers, but they really gained ground as a phenomenon in the 17th century. And compact planning, where houses built in 2 or 3 pile configurations, is one of the great innovations of the 17th century. And again, it's led by craftspeople and clients. So here's Dutch House for Hugh, built by a merchant called Samuel Fortree, and Boston Manor in Middlesex. The culture of the gable was very well established. So in order to make double pile houses in these cases, the builders had just put 2 traditional gable roofs on with a valley gutter in between, and they're using gables in that decorative way that had run right through the 15th and 16th centuries. But the coming thing was the hipped roof, and the hipped roof made a dramatic return to polite architecture from about the 1620s. And there's a funny thing about this. Hipped roofs were very well known to English carpenters and society. You look at these buildings here and you realize that they were absolutely ubiquitous across most of southern and eastern Midland and most of the Midland counties, but they hadn't been associated with domestic buildings of high status since the Norman conquest, since King Edward the Confessor held court in a hall looking something like, I think that's Manor Farm Barn at Harmondsworth on the right, for some reason. But on the continent, of course, hipped roofs and pavilion roofs could be found on very grand buildings indeed, like the Chateau of Fontainebleau, and of course the very steep roof pitches, effective in shedding heavy rainfalls and snowfalls, and could make a dramatic skyline. And we know that the French love of dramatically modelled and articulated skylines is something which went far back into the Middle Ages and is seen in marvellous form here. And they existed in Italy, but whereas in France and in Germany and the Netherlands, they tended to be very steep, in Italy, with its different climate, they tended to be a lot lower pitched. This is the Villa di Castello, with a low-pitched tiled roof, and on the right of the plate from Rubens' Palazzi di Genova, with a rather steeper roof. I don't know what that would have been roofed in. I would guess clay tiles, but I'm not quite sure. And the earliest examples we have of hipped roofs on domestic buildings of high status in England are probably associated with Inigo Jones. And so here is a point where one may have to concede that an important architect actually did have a major role in reintroducing something to fashionable society. Chevening has an annoyingly wide date range. It's not a very securely dated house, and it's only attributed to Jones. The design on the right is one of a number of hipped roof buildings. And remember that Jones had been to France and Italy, and he would have seen lots and lots of hipped roof buildings. And he would have known that a hipped roof is compatible with classical principles of design, as in the right-hand image, in a way which a gabled building like these is not, and that is presumably part of the point. But the gable tradition, the tradition of ornamented gables, was very, very strong in England, as it was throughout Germany, throughout the Empire, and throughout the Netherlands. And the last great decade for gable design, in particular shaped gables, was as late as the 1530s, as at Kew Palace and the very wonderful Brum Park in Kent. But thereafter, the tradition fell away very swiftly in the southeast and Midlands counties. I think the swiftness is slightly increased by the drop in the volume of building caused by the Civil War in the 1640s. So the gable and a variety in window design is still in sort of full flood in the 1630s. The Civil War kills a lot of new building projects, and by that time things start again in the 1650s, somehow the tradition has expired across all the more prosperous areas of England. Now, a hipped roof looks deceptively simple from the outside, but they mask a range of types, as many of you will know. It's easy to span a single pile building with a hipped roof because you don't need timbers that are really any longer than a traditional gabled roof. But for a double pile house, the shape of the frame gets more complicated, and I think you may need longer timbers in which to make it. And so the various different types of hipped roof evolved, at any rate certainly evolved in England during the 17th century. How far these borrowed from continental examples, I couldn't really say. So here are four of the main types. Simple on the top, crown flat, as it's called, where you have the potential for a roof platform, as at Coal Hill. Quite a lot of them are either U-shaped, like Up Ark, or have a central light well, as Moor Park in Hertfordshire did, and a lot have M roofs or valley gutters, something of hostage to fortune, as many of you will know. But by 1700, the gable tradition has pretty much disappeared, because the 45-degree gable is fundamentally incompatible with principles of classical design. Or is it because of that? I would suggest that rather that there's a symbiosis between factors here. And I'd suggest that one of the major factors here is thermal efficiency. This double pile building with a hipped roof is probably cheaper to build, and is certainly cheaper and easier to heat than a building composed of ranges 1 room deep. And so that's the theme we'll consider next. And in this respect, this factor, I think, really is driven by society, by the clients and the craftspeople exclusively, so far as I can see. And this is an absolutely fundamental one. Until the 16th century, most ordinary houses in England had earth floors and central hearths and holes or louvers in the roof to let the smoke out. Now, houses of that type almost ipso facto do not survive. There are very occasionally places where a great hall, like the Great Hall of Penshurst Place, has been preserved with its central hearth, because the whole of the rest of the house, of course, has fireplaces. And so houses of this kind with central hearths just don't exist. The houses of that age, which do exist, have been retrofitted with chimneys, and very often have had their halls floored across. And if you're a buildings archaeologist, one of the great pleasures of investigating early houses, medieval houses and 16th century houses, is to find smoke-blackened timbers and smoke-blackened thatch above a modern ceiling on the underside, especially of a thatched roof, because you may understand, you have a thatched roof, you don't need to take off all the thatch, renew the outer layers. And so if you go into the loft of a house and you see thatch which looks like that, you know you are looking at a house which for the first 100, 200 years of its life had a central hearth, and then and only then had a chimney put in, and had a ceiling closing off that roof. And so the smoke blackened thatch survives with all sorts of things like seeds and pollen from the food which was being cooked over the fire. So it's very exciting for archaeologists. The great rebuilding, 16th and 17th century England, which you've already referred to, potentially embraces several rounds of rebuilding and renovation, and it operated to different timeframes in different regions. So in Kent, Wealden houses which one are they? The second down on the right, a Wealden house with a central hearth in a hall like Bayleaf, might be built in that form in the 15th century, and in the 16th century, it might very probably have a brick stack added, and the hall could then be floored across to make a whole extra room. And that's a very common pattern of development for Wealden houses in Kent. They rather rarely retain the full height original hall, because once you'd added a chimney, you could have a whole extra big bedroom there. So why wouldn't you? Because the chimney made it all easier to heat anyway. But in the 16th century, house forms were developing which incorporated internal chimneys from the outset. And there were two major forms of these. There are the lobby entry house, which is the third down, and the half passage house, which is the third down, and the lobby entry house, which is the one you see below that. And these were being built in large numbers in southern, east and middle counties, most commonly as timber framed houses, but with brick stacks, and the brick stacks from being on the outside wall are now on an inside wall, because the builders were realizing that it was far more thermally efficient to keep the stack inside the house, and furthermore it provided the structural benefit of massive brickwork at the heart of your structure. And so quite large numbers of lobby entry houses and half passage houses survive in England. In the 16th century, chimneys in fine houses were still often located on external walls. This is Whitehall in Shrewsbury of the about 1580, and that is a compact house, as you see. It's compact in its plan, but it still has gables, and it has the stacks are mostly located on the external walls in the old-fashioned way. So they are very prominent as part of the design. But as compact plans evolved in the 17th century, there was a tendency for them to move to internal walls, often on spine walls, as at Thorpe Hall. And this removal of chimneys from the external walls to internal walls, well, it was one of several factors which allowed facades to be designed in accordance with classical principles, as I think you see here. The stacks there would very much prevent Whitehall from being designed in accordance with classical principles. Thorpe Hall, designed by Peter Mills, is, but because the stacks had been moved inboard. But there were other reasons for locating chimney stacks on internal walls, of course. It allowed them to serve more hearths, far more thermally efficient. It provides a solid mass of masonry within the building. And this was very much tied up with the spread in the use of brick. And I don't think this particular change could have come about without the widespread use of brick, because stacks with multiple flues on several floors, if they're going to feed the same chimney, require complex shapes which would really be unfeasible in stone. Bricks, being small, uniform and heatproof, are ideal for forming these complex shapes which really would not be possible in stone. So here is another plate from my book, and this shows some of the different ways in which chimney stacks could be moved onto internal walls in fairly smart 17th century houses. And Boston Manor, they're on the spine wall. At Chevening, they're on the two cross walls. At Coles Hill, they're partly on the walls of the spinal corridor. They're partly on the end wall still. And at Thorpe Hall, they're in the spine walls that frame the stair compartment. And on the right, perhaps more revealingly, we have a plate from Moxon's Mechanic Exercises. And this is really fascinating when you start to think about the implications of the stack that he's showing here. Look how generous his provision is. 8 flues shown there. So the implication is that it's a 4-story house with 2 hearths on each floor, a surprisingly generous provision, and a very elaborate structure which has to be built here, which would obviously only be feasible in brick. And so Moxon is setting out how to do this in some detail. By the 18th century, the habit of locating stacks within terrace houses declined, as we've seen, in favour of putting them on the party walls, which allowed chimneys to be shared between houses. And this, of course, meant that the whole internal structure could be, and often was, made of timber. So this changed the change from timber to coal as the primary source of heating, and the multiplication in the number of hearths per house was one of the fundamental factors driving the transformation of architecture in the 17th century. The decline of timber and the rise in coal as the primary heating source, especially in towns and cities, is a really fundamental factor here, because, of course, coal is a lot denser and heavier than wood. There's about 4 times as much stored calorific value by mass in coal as there is in wood, which means you get more heat from a smaller fire. But it also means that to burn efficiently, the fire has to be contained. You have to allow for a draft under it, so it has to have a grate, it has to have a well-formed fireplace and a well-shaped, fairly narrow flue to draw the smoke up efficiently, because, of course, coal fires produce sulfur dioxide, produce toxic fumes, visible thick black toxic fumes, which coal fires do not. Of course, which wood fires do not. Of course, both wood and coal fires produce carbon monoxide, which is, of course, potentially lethal, but that wasn't known in the 17th century because it's colourless and odourless. And I think we have to assume that in early times, the high interiors and the ventilation associated with central hearths tended to disperse the carbon monoxide. Well, venting a coal fire became a much more urgent priority, and so flue design and stack design became much more urgent priority for builders, with the implications for domestic architecture that we have just seen. And as you will note, not one architect's name has come up here. This is something which was developed, negotiated by craftsmen and their clients between themselves over the course of the 17th century. As you probably know, Charles II's government enacted a very unpopular hearth tax in around 1667, and there were hearth tax returns until it was repealed in the 1690s, and they'd been published for many English counties, and they show how the number of hearths per house proliferated down the social scale by the late 17th century, and even common labourers might expect to have a house with 2 hearths in it, and farmers would have houses with 3 or 4 hearths, and great houses, of course, might have 40 hearths. So English houses were better heated and more rooms were individually heated, with implications for privacy and the way in which houses were used never before. But one rather ironic point about this is that as coal fire heating became ubiquitous, and as as houses grew more and more fireplaces and chimneys, they receded as external design. The rules of classism offered a few clues as to how to deal with them, and generally in front of a Palladian mansion like Hagley Hall or walking down a Georgian street, you very often hardly notice them at all. Lighting and window design is another area. There's a rather complex interplay, I think, between the influence of classicism and the interests of clients, and the influence of the climate, indeed. Medieval England had a great, and I think you can say almost unrivaled, tradition for making of spectacular traceried church windows involving very, very high levels of craft skill, as at York Minster, which we see here. And by the late 15th century, it was manifesting itself in secular contexts like Sudeley Castle here. Very large traceried windows and high levels of craft and technical skill in leading and glazing them, making the whole thing stand up. And there must have been an elaborate culture of collaboration between the smiths and the plumbers and the masons and the glaziers here, which is largely lost to us. And in the 16th century, masons established a design lexicon for mullioned and transom windows, and facades of grand houses were generally designed primarily in terms of the window grid, an aesthetic inheritance in the perpendicular tradition. So here are 2 contrasting examples: Barrington Court and Lanhydrock. Lanhydrock, probably the last great courtyard house to be built from scratch in England in the 1640s. But note how far the horizontal emphasis is incompatible with classical principle design, which rest on the implied idea that there's a row of columns, a sort of somewhere as a ghostly presence, imposing upright proportions. Upright window shapes became established in English masons' design lexicon over the course of the 16th century. And one of the earliest examples we have is Somerset House, probably designed by a French mason who's anonymous, if you've seen in John Thorpe's record drawing of it on the left. And on the right, of course, is the gallery range at Bolsover Castle, built in the 1630s by the mason Huntingdon Smithson. And upright shape, of course, are compatible with classical design principles. And here, the name which comes into the offing again is that of Inigo Jones, who travels to Italy with the Earl and Countess of Arundel in 1612. And it may well have been him who designed the Italian window at Brindle House, which was later drawn by John Smithson. And you can see John's drawing of it here. He was so fascinated that he made little opening paper flaps to represent the shutters. And as you see, if you look at, and he drew its plan very carefully to show its construction. And as you can see, it has an external crossbar frame, which will be fixed, and it has quite heavily framed opening lights. There's a light which is going to open inwards first, and the shutters are framed into the opening lights. And John's obviously fascinated by this, and he calls this an Italian window very significantly. Now, books like those published by Palladio and Serlio just showed upright window shapes of darkness without any real indication of how they were glazed in Italy. And this, of course, is how it was normally done, with a timber crossbar, leaded glazing, and with casement lights in the lower lights, as Jones himself did at the banqueting house in Whitehall. And so on the right, you can see the banqueting house, it's open, and King Charles I meeting his unfortunate end. Silly man. As with gables, the 1630s was the last decade in which the Elizabethan variety of window design could still be seen. There was a remarkable variety in window design in English architecture, really from the mid-16th century into the mid-17th century. You have low, sort of long, low mullioned windows, you have square mullioned windows, you have huge mullioned and transom windows, have oriel windows of various shapes, you have upright windows, but they're mixed in with all sorts of other window shapes. And there's Swateley's in Middlesex of the late 1630s, built for a London merchant, and as you see, it has square windows in the attic, but it still has big, swanky mullioned transom windows and bay windows, just as you might find on Elizabethan mansion of the 1670s or 80s. But by the 1650s, this tradition was in galloping decline, had almost disappeared startlingly quickly from southern and eastern England by the Commonwealth period. So there's Thorpe Hall, built by London mason Peter Mills, with its upright windows with crossbar glazing. But very few 17th century buildings still retain original crossbar glazing with casements, and Wolsey Castle at Winchester is a case in point. Now, this is the swiftness of the decline of that variety of window design. You might have thought clients would want bay windows and clients might want big mullioned and transom windows, and the fact that they're still there before the Civil War and across much of England after is disconcerting. Is it because of cultural classicism, when classical principles of design, or is it because England was becoming so much colder and houses with big windows are necessarily harder to eat? I suspect that I suspect that both factors were involved, but I strongly suspect that thermally efficiency might fundamentally have been more efficient, have been more important to clients. The next step forward, and this is one of the rare cases in this story where we can trace something probably to a specific event, is the introduction of the sliding sash window. And what I mean by this is that the lower lights, which at Wolsey Castle we made of casements to probably to open outwards, the lower lights are made as sliding sashes. The upper lights are still fixed, the lower light is made as a sliding sash. This was invented in Paris, sometimes in the mid-17th century, and it seems to have been introduced to England by Craftsmen in the suite of the Dowager Queen Henrietta Maria and installed at Somerset House for her. And there's the earliest surviving example in England at Charles II's hunting lodge at Newmarket, which is dated by the architect William Samwell. And here is a graphic for my book, which illustrates the evolution of window design in the 17th century, that you start with wide mullioned shapes and opening casements. You also have the mullioned and transom shapes, where with opening casements necessarily in lower lights. The late 16th century, you have upright window shapes, where the cross is still formed in stone, and you have opening casements in lower lights. You have the change from stone to crossbar glazing in timber happening from the 1630s onwards, and then you have the fundamental change whereby the crossbar now frames sliding sashes in the low lights rather than opening casements. And in the last 2 decades of the 17th century, surprisingly quickly, there's this realization that you could make the whole window, you could make the sliding sash the whole width, and that was happening in the 1680s and 90s. It's happening at Chatsworth, happening at Hampton Court, and it spread down the social scale and was picked up by the carpenters and joiners in the towns remarkably quickly, and crossbar glazing was displaced very fast. So there is a definite, a fairly clear action in window design, where I think one should allow the architects a little more influence, but still this is something which is being negotiated between craftspeople and their clients. I've already talked a bit. One of the peculiarities of this subject is I've already introduced several of the themes here more than once, so I can speed up a bit, which is just as well. I've talked about the way in which in medieval culture and in Tudor building culture, most buildings were formed of ranges 1 room deep. And here are 3 Tudor courtyard houses which illustrate this point: Cote Hill and Compton Wynyates. At Compton Wynyates, the bit at the top, which is shaded slightly darker, that's a 19th century addition, and it was built as ranges 1 room deep, just like Cote Hill and Cowdray House work. And Cowdray compact plans had been built in Elizabethan and Victorian England in small numbers, like these 2 fine examples. Clegg Hall in Lancashire is a double part. Again, it has 2 standard gable roofs with a valley gutter between them. And the development of compact plans we've already looked at in terms of the rise of hitch roofs, but compact plans come first. Compact plans, with their greater thermal efficiency, which will almost cheaper to build, too, predated hitch roofs, as you see from the dates of Boston Manor and Kew Palace. And the idea that if you built a building which is this sort of solid oblong shape, you could put a different kind of roof over it more cheaply and conveniently, and in a way which is also compatible, more compatible with classical principles of design, that may owe quite a lot to Inigo Jones. But how far one can be sure of that, I really don't know. I would hesitate to be too definitive about that. In Berkshire, often regarded as a perfect example of the compact house. And so the great advances in 17th century planning was the move towards compact plans, because they're easier to heat, they're almost certainly more economic to build, and they encourage a different kind of disposition of plan. If your house is arranged around a courtyard, like a great Tudor house, with a courtyard house, generally your hall will be in the middle. You will live in apartments on the first floor, and your household will be disposed around the other lodging. The kitchen staff will live in kitchens, and your steward and your chaplain will have lodging chambers. And people are disposed around the buildings in rather the way they were in Oxford or Cambridge College. And the hierarchy is in terms of where you are in the ranges of the building. So there's a high end of the hall and a low end of the hall, and the lord and lady are at the high end, and the kitchen servants at the low end, and the chaplain has a chamber somewhere near the chapel. And it's arranged in a sort of topographical way like that. But once you move to a compact mode of organization, it has to go out of the window and come in back by the basement door, because in a house like Coleshill, the servants, from having their place in the ranges to either side of the gatehouse, are banished. They no longer dine in the hall, they no longer sleep in the hall. My goodness me, no. The hall, from being the common space for the house, is now a grand entrance hall for Sir George Pratt and his posh visitors. And the servants work in the basement and sleep in the attic. So another major aspect in the development and spread of compact planning is that it pushes the plan towards a sort of vertical hierarchy, a vertical segregation towards the servants being in the basement and the attic, just as they would be in a London terrace house. And I would suggest that all the thermal efficiency, cheapness of building, principles of design, getting the servants out of sight either downstairs or upstairs, these factors all come together in a very complex process, which is working in clients' minds as much as in the craftsmen's minds. No dirty servants being toing and froing from the hall. And in my last section, of course, is the rise of the urban terrace house. And I think that this evolves out of the medieval past rather more than people might think. I think when you look at those houses on Cheapside, in that rather wonderful survey on the right, you can see that there is these are the ancestors of terrace houses with shop premises. So in the Middle Ages, towns were organised with burgage plots. The frontages to the street or marketplace were quite densely lined. This is a very wonderful survey of Chelmsford made by John Walker in 1582. The houses line the marketplace, which is more or less the town. The back premises extend behind. Burgage plots are shown, but you can tell they're there from the shapes of back premises. And the idea that houses should present a uniform and fairly continuous frontage to the street to market as a way of forming the public realm is well ingrained in English building, in medieval building culture. And here on the right, you see it in London, and one can see very clearly the London terrace house might evolve out of the densely packed urban houses lining the streets of London in this kind of way. And there are the terrace house in Stoke Newington. See that in the medieval way, they still have their roofs at right angles to the street rather than running continuously to the street as they normally do on terrace houses. So these are still very much in planning terms, the same kind of houses as those you see in the view of Cheapside, but they've been given a facade and smart Doric pilasters. And so a traditional English house form is being made to wear a classical. And we've already, I don't need to say a lot about this because we've already reviewed how the terrace house originates from the shift from full timber framing with brick infill to thin-walled brick construction arising from England's timber famine, the rising cost of timber, from the falling cost of brick, and from shifts in working practices in the building industry. Bricklayers or carpenters commonly work together, and a project could be managed equally well by either. Architects were involved in the margins here, like notably Inigo Jones as authors of the various royal proclamations, but my strong feeling is that although successive London building acts helped shape the class of terrace houses, helped to shape their appearance, construction standards and design, that they were moulding something that was already coming into existence in the everyday flow of building culture. And if they'd specified anything which was too alien to that culture, they would just have been ignored. And so we get the gamut of London terrace houses. There are some in Albury Street in Deptford, which I might be about the third rate, and some very first rate houses in Queen Anne's Gate. And as in London, so across much of England. I was delighted to find this view of Chelmsford because it really is worth of English street architecture. And if you look quite hard, remember that we've seen Chelmsford not long before. Here's Chelmsford in 1882, and the whole town consists of timber-framed houses with red tile roofs with chimneys. And by English standards, the people of Chelmsford, in fertile, lush East Anglia, were warm and comfortable. And you can tell they were prosperous because look what's happened in less than a century. 80 years later, how many of those framed houses are left? Well, I think there's a couple there. I think that's one here. There might be a couple hiding behind some of these facades, like that house in Shrewsbury, but it's hard to be sure. Here we have a mid-17th century inn with mid-17th century crossbar glazing. Here we have roofs which are still projecting, but projecting eaves of this kind, of course, were banned by one of the London Building Acts, I think one in the early 1700s, and thereafter roofs were supposed to be hidden behind parapets to protect them from fire. So we have the evolution of English, of standard English house design, from timber framing to the frame being covered up with render. I suspect what's going on here, to being replaced in masonry with crossbar glazing, to it being replaced in brick with a valley gutter, to it being replaced in brick with a parapet hiding the roof. And here are doubtless the newest houses. And note that they have shutters on the outside because the street was getting so noisy. And I suspect that this was probably the last generation for whom the High Street in Chelmsford was a smart residential address, and before Chelmsford middle classes and the gentry started to abandon it for new suburbs and leave the High Street commerce. And so there, the two views between them capture Chelmsford's evolution and the move from from a situation in which timber framing was ubiquitous to one in which it was a matter of a few historical survivals overwhelmed by thin-walled brick construction. So what a difference a century made. The Hall and the College of Matrons in Salisbury, both very fine examples of what you could reasonably call vernacular English architecture of a century apart. English architecture had been transformed as to plan types, construction methods, approaches to heating, lighting, and ventilation, where the servants are, window design, how rooms were decorated, roof designs, roof shapes, hardly any aspect of building, of the construction and planning of ordinary domestic buildings had been unaffected by this revolution. And yet, where were the professionals? There were, as yet, hardly any professionals. They were nowhere in sight. And I would suggest that the building world of the 18th century, the building world which famous architects, famous engineers worked in, swam in, operated in, had been created in all essentials by anonymous craftsmen in complex negotiation with their clients, who, remember, in many cases would have been a very superior social status to them, and with the yet more shadowy people who supplied the building material, that complex triangular relationship had shaped the modern building world. Out with old England, in with the new. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Listening to Stephen is like a bit like watching the 2:30 at Chepstow, isn't it? I mean, things flash by you so fast that you can't remember what it is you've heard and how it all fits together. Does anyone want to open our discussion by venturing to contradict anything that Stephen has said, or want to add something that they've observed? Yes, Mike.
I agree with what Steve said in a way. The craftspeople, if you like, must have been the key to it all. But I went to a house in Conway in the spring. Normally I go to the castle and the Telford Bridge and and I think it's a house by the Glen, but the chap who was the client had been in the Low Countries, and there's a courtyard house there which is clearly modelled on what we've seen in the Low Countries in the 16th century. So it seems to me that the fact that clients were able to travel and see stuff, some of them would have come back and said, I want you to build this. And that must have been quite a challenge for some of these particular people in North Wales, which you didn't mention at all. So I think that the ability of the client to see stuff beyond the ken, if you like, of craftspeople must have been significant as well. How many buildings? It's an issue at all. We're not living in isolation. The BRICS come from the Low Countries, so I think England is not an island except an island. You know?
I absolutely do, Mike. Yes, I quite agree. The relation between craftspeople and clients, given their likely social inequality, one of the most difficult things to grasp here, when most of the craftspeople had a social status roughly alongside yeoman farmers, and so many of the craftspeople were of very much higher social status, and that's one of the hard things, and for whom their rank in society and their prestige would have been a significant consideration. I think that there is, but in traditional architectural history, the tendency to assume that the spread of the classical principles of design is kind of led by Inigo Jones. It is the one important story, seems to me to be entirely historical, and that this must necessarily be mixed up with all sorts of other considerations. I mean, not least, how did the classical principles actually spread, given how few of the major classical textbooks were really available in any widespread way in the British Isles before the 1700s. But they were mixed up with lots of other considerations, which must have been just as important, in which social propriety, privacy, segregation of the servants, brick construction, lighting, thermal efficiency would have been right up there. And the conversations, I think, must have been complex and not simple. And the whole story is complex and not simple, and entirely unrecorded, of course.
Yes, David.
There's so much to explore, and that was wonderful. One thing I'd like to look at is coal and chimneys, which are obviously so important and influence so much, even what sort of culture you have of eating out or staying in, etc. But sea coal is being imported to London from at least the 12th century and in considerable quantities in the Middle Ages. So I suppose my question, I'd always assumed that coal was being consumed in partly in domestic houses. And that presumes that there must have been chimneys in London from the late Middle Ages, but fairly ordinary houses.
I think it really does. I suppose the chimneys must initially have been of stone, or else it was being used in for industrial purposes, which is also possible, because coal certainly gives off much nastier fumes than wood, and you don't really want them in your open wall house, or I don't think you would, gassing your servants and turning the roof flat. Yeah, that is a really interesting one. I didn't realise that sea coal was being imported into London quite that early.
I can see Andrew wants to come in here. Andrew Saint, this is for those.
Comments. Stephen, one of the surprising things you said, though absolutely not disputing, I'm sure you're completely correct, is the collapse of the gable, as it were, during the Civil War period.
Yeah.
That's very different from what happens in the Low Countries, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the fantastic houses in the Grand Place at Brussels or in Amsterdam, a lot of those are still very wildly gabled up to 1700 and beyond. So somehow
I didn't realise they.
they're very remarkably late. So it's as though the British are going kind of boring in their gables and getting rid of their gables than anybody else. I don't know what the French were doing. Perhaps the French were about contemporary with us. I don't know. That was one comment.
Which had to travel quite a long way from London to find a new gabled house going up in England much after 1650, wouldn't you? Where I grew up in Lancashire, farmhouses were still being built. The last farmhouses being built with 45-degree pitch gables in the early 1700s, but not much into the 18th century. But that's a long way from London. And if you go to the Lake District, 45-degree pitch roofs and gables into the early 18th century, maybe. But they're a long way from London, and that's the point, surely.
The compact house plan, you were very anti-architectural about it, but a lot of people think it began with Serlio, don't they? I mean, I'm talking about an architect. The Serlio books have it before Palladio Vicenza Villa and so forth.
Yeah.
And Serlio was quite well diffused in various ways in the 17th century.
Yes, he was. And I hadn't really thought of that looking as an influence, Andrew, so thank you for that.
There's a gentleman here.
Only to say, if you want some recent gables, Lyle Street in Soho, it's got a whole selection of different approaches to gables down the street. That must be 1890, 1850, something like that. So it's very recent. But the point I was going to make is there's an interesting sequential illustration, if you're interested, in where the Fortune Theatre was built in Shoreditch. It had originally brick foundations under a timber frame, 3-story timber frame theatre. It was converted, it was adapted to become a timber framed front room and a masonry back room. And that's part of the business. And the masonry back room was built on the original foundations for the Fortune frame. But the reason for this was that the kitchen came into the house. In the terrace house, the kitchen was always in the back of the garden for fire reasons until, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of the 16th century. That was the standard one. Still see it in the Caribbean today. Those houses lasted from 1660, when they were first built, until 1930. And in that time, they were brick-clad, they were adapted, all the component parts were renewed, and they must have been in different styles. And they're all nicely recorded. I mean, they're not illustrated as you have beautifully done tonight, but they are recorded in the Dulwich archives. So you can pattern a whole terrace right through 200 years. 300
That's
years.
really interesting. I didn't know about that source.
Yes.
And bricklayer, in the 1530s, the surveyor for the King's works moved from a carpenter to a mason. And in 60, you don't get increased building prices for bricklayers until into the 17th century. You can follow those in, I'm trying to remember the man's name, but anyway, there's a splendid tome produced in Oxford of recorded prices at the colleges over dozens of years.
Wonderful. Sarah Harrison.
Well, I was just wondering about all those bricks and the people needed to create all those bricks. And is this partly to do with people working less on the land? Is it to do with urbanization that you've got these vast numbers?
Mike Crichton made a point to me before this talk that in the 18th century, builders, persons planning to build, directors of canal companies, the owners of country houses, would typically start by stockpiling materials for a year or two beforehand. And for anything like a project like a canal, like a major new house, like a mill, enormous quantities of bricks were needed. You would need to identify an area, whether on your estate or not, with suitable brick earth, and you would need to find brick burners. And my feeling is that, I don't have any detailed knowledge of this, that brick makers were one of those sort of submerged areas of Georgian society, one of those itinerant elements generally regarded sort of like gypsies as not very respectable, not quite reputable, had to move around in search of work. Often people who'd been forced off the land, that was all they could do. Go to where there was need for bricks, and they would dig the brick pits and make the clamps and fire the bricks until the contract was completed for so many pence per 1,000. And I think every now and then you come across this in a rather incidental way
in late 8th century and 9th century literature about brick makers being among the lowest of learned society, in the same way that nail makers were the very bottom of the pile in the metalwork trades, and there was lots of rather these marginalised lives. And I think brick making was a sort of a marginalised trade by itinerant people, like a predecessor to the navigators who actually dug canals, and who must have moved around to where there was demand for them. But on the skirts of London, there would have been constant demand, and brick fields, of course, when the brick fields were exhausted, then would become building sites. But there must have been great areas, the outskirts of London, pockmarked with brick fields, from the city's incessant demand for millions and millions of bricks. Yes, but it's so little documented, like so many other aspects of this story, that we only glimpse it occasionally, don't we? But absolutely fundamental, as you say. Can't make a city without bricks, can't make London.
Now, Rob is coming in with a question from beyond.
Yeah, we've got one question from Christine Stevenson in the Zoom audience. There's lots of hostility to supposedly jumped up and unqualified artisans in some later 17th century writing, thinking of John Evelyn and Roger North. Could that hostility have been a factor in the rise of the architectural profession? Something seems to have shifted in the early 18th century.
Christine, yes, most certainly is, isn't there? And Roger Pratt, mean workman, and as late as James Gibbs in his book of architecture, equally snobbish. Yes, and this clearly represents early attempts by the educated and the gentry to squeeze the craftsmen out from their agency and their influence on design. It took them a very long time to do it, of course, and as Conor Lucy showed in his book Building Reputations, the craftsmen held on to their central role in the building world through most of the way through the 18th century, by translating their own collected bodies of knowledge to paper, and by learning how to design in classical styles, by abandoning traditional vernacular styles. And they held on, especially in the towns and cities, remarkably well. And it's late in the 18th century before the architects are really squeezing them out and gaining control. In fact, I think one could say it's probably not until the 1800s, with the rise of contracting in gross, that the big contractors are really starting to squeeze out small tradespeople. So although members of the gentry from Roger North and John Evelyn and Roger Pratt onwards didn't think craftspeople had any business designing houses, well, they went on doing it, and people like the wonderful Batty Langley and William Houghney went on helping them retain their place in the process long into the Georgian age.
Yes, that was grateful to Christine Stevenson for bringing that point up, because I felt that there is a kind of flipping in the 18th century, isn't there, where the craftsmen feel that they're obliged to demonstrate that they do understand these things. When you open your Batty, it starts with an exclamation, an explanation, the orders.
Yeah.
And you think, oh gosh, I've got to learn these things, have I? Yes.
Yeah.
Before I get down to the really interesting bit about building the fireplace.
Yeah.
Yes.
But actually, the craftsman's explanations of how to design the classical orders are much better than the smart ones in William Chambers or James Gibbs's, because they dimension everything.
Yes.
They give all the portions, they actually tell you how to design it in detail. They're much more. Batty Langley is really helpful.
Yes.
He proportions everything.
Now, Rob's got another question coming in from beyond.
It's more of a comment, I think, than a question. From David Cupley. There's a difference in brickmaking between brickmasters who own the brick field and the permanent staff on brick fields that worked the full year, as opposed to the seasonal influx of brickmakers, brick field labourers, who were the lowest of brickmaking teams.
That's really interesting. I suppose it would make a huge difference whether you were a brickmaster who actually owned the land and owned the material, or whether you were a team of brick makers camping out on an estate and making bricks for the landowner. That would make a huge difference, wouldn't it? I suppose a lot of the bricks used in London would have been supplied by contractors who managed to buy pockets of land with brick earth. But thank you very much for that. I'd never really thought about that.
Anyone else in the room who would, yes?
Yes, you spoke eloquently at the beginning about the partition of masonry and timber craftsmen. I'm aware that by the time we get to Victorian terraces, the facades are built by class 1 masonry craftsmen. The party walls by class 2. I just wondered how far back does that go?
We don't know at all. I would suspect that in most London houses, great majority of London terrace houses surely are built of brick, not stone. And even where they're faced in stone, the stone is only a facing. And that we all know that the quality of the bricks on the smart terrace house facade may be no indication the quality of brickworks that you find behind, as many architects and engineers must have found to their dismay in working on historic buildings. We know that lath and plaster and that covers up a multitude of bricklayers' sins in London terrace houses. And I suppose that if you are a London bricklayer and you really know how to do that stuff, then you put your best bricklayers on the front, and you put your common labourers in the basement and on the party walls, where the shoddy workmanship will be covered up. I never knew that there was a formalised distinction between
maybe just the one team, and they're just using different kind of bricks.
Yes. Yeah, or maybe so.
Yes.
Yeah. Gosh, what a nasty lot what the nasty bricks we've got today.
Yeah.
Better hide them somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Malcolm.
Did religion have any influence on domestic architecture in your period, considering how much influence it had on other aspects of life?
Oh gosh. Much less than you might think, I think, is my first rather cautious reply. Oh gosh. In medieval culture, religious patronage is the central driving force of architectural development. And it disappears with devastating suddenness between about 1534 and 1550, between Henry's declaration, between the Act of Supremacy and the last of probably the Chanters Act, or the Act for the Defacing of Images. And so that the whole of religious patronage disappears devastatingly suddenly. And what you see is a whole range of approaches to architecture. One of the surprising things about Protector Somerset's government is that the government which enacted the Reformation by Act of Parliament and was directly responsible for the destruction of the chantries and the destruction of huge quantities of religious art, they were interested in architecture. They were interested in Renaissance architecture. Somerset House was the first building designed on more or less classical principles in England, and several members of his circle, Sir Thomas Smith, William Cecil, Thomas Thynne of Longleat, and the other one, William Sharrington of Laycock, all built early Renaissance-inspired buildings in England. And William Sharrington took over an Augustinian nunnery at Laycock and preserved the whole cloister and the whole of the cloister arrangement there, which certainly wasn't out of nostalgia for the monastic past, because Sharrington was a radical Calvinist Protestant in Protector Somerset's government. And some of the most radical Protestants in England, who were members of Somerset's circle, like Thomas Thynne of Longleat and William Cecil of Burghley, were among the most advanced architectural patrons responsible for introducing French and Flemish masons and Renaissance architectural ideas into England. So it's certainly not true to say that radical Protestants were entirely Philistine, although they may have been entirely indifferent to and indeed hostile to religious art. Some of them were intensely interested in architecture. And some of the finest mid-17th century houses were built by parliamentarians, by people who opposed thing. People who supported the king in most cases were really in no position to build by then, of course. But buildings as various as Lanhydrock in Cornwall, built by Sir Richard Robarts. He was a lead miner, landowner. He was a Puritan. He built the last great courtyard house in a completely old-fashioned sort of way. Oliver St. John, MP, I think Speaker of the House of Commons, built Thorpe Hall, Peterborough, one of the most advanced house. What's he called? John Shute of the Vine, I think was certainly a Puritan MP. He built the first portico on any country house in England at the Vine. And Wilton House, with famous interiors, built by the Earl of Pembroke, who'd gone over from the Royalist to the Parliamentarian side. So although the Commonwealth regime was overtly hostile to religious art and sanctioned the destruction of much more of it, and was the most overtly Philistine regime, I would suggest, ever to have ruled England, banned the theatre and all that, but individual members of it were immensely interested in architecture and commissioned very interesting buildings. So one can't generalize easily. You might associate an interest in grand architecture, in fine, in classical architecture with Catholicism, but it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. No.
So the one common we find was that they had prosperity.
The common point is having money.
Yeah.
To build.
Yeah.
But there certainly isn't any easy correlation between Catholic means you're sympathetic to the Renaissance and classical architecture, and Puritan meaning you think it's all vanity. It's nothing like as simple as that. No.
They hadn't spent their money on indulgences. No. Does anyone else want to throw anything else in? I think, therefore, we should draw things to a conclusion, Stephen. A lady here, sorry.
Whether maybe it also aligned with your point about hierarchy in houses, and also as a sort of form of social control. Maybe there is a kind of link to be made with religion at that point, and maybe that's a complete coincidence, but it did just happen to align with how houses were being structured and social control.
Yes, there is a very important point to be made there, and thank you very much. The people who supported the king, great aristocracy, nobility with their hordes of servants and retainers, for whom the number of people who sat down to dine in their hall and who wore their livery was a key indicator of their status, like the Sackvilles at Knoll. They lived in grand courtyard houses, and they needed the space of a great castle, great courtyard house to house that kind of household. And a compact house of the kind we've been looking at generally was much too small for a traditional aristocratic household. And so in the late 17th century, you see that the aristocracy are presented with a dilemma. Do they abandon their own courtyard house? But if so, what sort of house do they build? And they have to devise ways of expanding the compact house, the formal house, to make it big enough to house apartments and state apartments. And the first approach to doing this was to design what they call pavilion houses, where you stick pavilions on the corners, which really started with Clarendon House. Now, aristocratic households with their hordes of retainers were themselves changing by the late 17th century as Baroque courts were developing more highly structured ritual and social etiquette. And so even amongst aristocratic households, the idea that you could come into a great hall full of milling with servants, and your servants would all eat there twice a day, every day, at your expense, that was already being, the idea was in decline after the Restoration. How this aligns with religious belief, I really couldn't say, because someone like Lady Anne Clifford, who's probably the most determinedly reactionary and old-fashioned builder in England, God bless her, and restored her castles just as they'd been in the time of her father and grandfather. I mean, she was herself a Puritan in religion, and she wasn't very sympathetic. She read the Bible every day. Most intelligent woman. but she was by no means a Catholic sympathizer. She wanted to hold court in the old-fashioned way. It doesn't mean she was Catholic sympathizer in any way. She wasn't. She was a Puritan religion, and she knew her Bible back to front. So it's a point I don't really understand, the relationship between religion and the organisation of households. What is certainly true is that ideas of hierarchy in households and how buildings should be structured to reflect that hierarchy changed radically, and that change represents the shift from the medieval to the modern. I mean, I think it parallels other beliefs and ideas. At the beginning of the century, people from King James I downwards could believe in witchcraft and alchemy. In 1663, Charles III gave his sign, his seal to the Royal Society. I mean, that is a representation of the scale of the generational change, the cultural change, seen from another point of view here. This is the 17th century is the tipping point between the medieval and the modern. And what I'm suggesting is that this is expressed in its buildings in this really very direct way. And that the modern, what we would think of as the modern building world, the building world of the Georgian and Victorian eras, was created not by them, but in the 17th century building revolution.
Stephen, I think if Lady Anne Clifford or any of the people you've been talking about were here this evening, they would have been absolutely fascinated by what you're saying and the way in which you're describing their mentality and the work of their craftsmen who they employed on their wonderful projects. We're all incredibly indebted to you. We're obviously going to have another series talking about bricks, coal, hierarchy, religion, the whole lot. And I look forward to seeing all of you. Yeah, but buy Stephen's book. And if you haven't done so already, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our online audience for staying the course. Sometimes when the technology didn't work. Did it work today, Rob? Great. So we've learned how to do it. A really great thanks to you, Stephen, for rounding off the series in such a bravado way. Thank you.